Hey there, Squirrel Army, how's it going for? Today we are discussing whether mana doublers are bad. You can join the Squirrel Army by subscribing. Okay, when I say mana doublers being bad, I'm more discussing whether mana doublers are worth it, I guess. Because in the end of the day, you can't say any card for the most part is strictly bad, because even some cards that have literal no text can be good in certain decks and in certain circumstances. Does depend on what you're kind of doing, but they certainly won't be probably as good as cards that actually have text and whatnot on themselves. So just having cards that are just generic cards usually isn't well worth the time, even if that's kind of what your deck's kind of doing with your commander or whatever. But again, getting back to the point of saying, well, are mana doublers worth it? And I don't honestly think that they're worth the time to play. There are a couple of exceptions that I would say are worth the time to play, and there are some decks that they are certainly worth the time to play them in. But for the most part, I find that most mana doublers aren't very useful. That's perhaps what I'll say more so for most decks. I see so many people jamming all of these 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and whatever else mana value, mana doublers. And it's like, well, dude, you already have, 6 manas or whatever it is to play, 5 or 6 mana to play these mana doublers. And yes, going from having 6 mana to having, or whatever, from 5 mana to 12 mana, or from 6 mana to 12 mana is really good. Most of the time, that's not where EDH is anymore. Like, back in the day, I think that was probably, one of the better things that you could do, because I think there was a lot less interaction in the format and removal in the format and whatnot. But now I don't think that it's really worth the time to play those things unless you're going to get your mana's worth out of them. There are, again, exceptions to this sort of thing, because like Nyxbloom Ancient, I have that in a deck. It doesn't literally double your mana, but like doubling your mana versus tripling your mana is a bit different, but not significantly so, I would say. I think Nyxbloom Ancient performs a similar task, but for that deck that it's in, it works pretty well because my commander wants me to have my creatures tapping for at least 3 mana, so that I can draw cards in that deck, and I've tried to make it a very big mana deck, or have lots of abilities to use that mana. And that's what I mean by saying, even if you think you have a lot of creatures in your deck or whatever, for the most part, these mana doublers don't really help you that much, because again, like, you really want the mana doublers or whatever to have that ability to siphon off mana or to use mana on themselves, or you want lots of other ways to, use your mana on other things, activate other activated abilities and whatnot, those sorts of things. Leyline of Abundance isn't too bad of a one. I don't put it in all of my decks, even the decks that could, maybe you'd argue, be able to use it, but it's just like, well, the mana ability is too high for what the rest of the deck's already kind of doing, and so that next piece of text to add counters to everything isn't that relevant. Again, it is one of my decks in that same deck that Nyxbloom Ancient is in, because again, that's a deck that has a lot of mana sometimes laying around, and just adding more mana is really good anyway, because again, you want your creatures to be tapping for as much mana as you can to get those card draw effects with Ingra and Esika. But again, like, it at least has that other ability to buff up my creatures as well when I don't have anything else to kind of do, or when I need to start trying to go, okay, I need to start trying to close this game out or try to win somehow. Because again, though it does have some very big creatures, it also has a bunch of small mana dorks that aren't really doing anything. for the most part, and can't really get in for combat damage. And even when you do buff them, they don't have natural evasion for the most part. But again, at least it makes them bigger and harder to kind of deal with, and it makes them better blockers, at least to a degree as well. So that is useful in that regard. So again, we get back to this using the whole of the Buffalo type philosophy, and I want to talk a bit more about the whole of the Buffalo philosophy here in terms of the game state in Magic and EDH specifically. But like this whole theory of we really don't want just cards that exist and don't really have another realm to them, another ability to them, because again, once you have this mana doubler, unless it's a creature like Regal Behemoth, which can block for you, then it's tough. Like, it's one of those things. It's very difficult, and again, like, you only have double mana when you're the Monarch with that, and things like that, but still, it's pretty good, because again, it does give you that slight amount of card draw, and if you're in a dinosaur deck, perhaps that's one of your best dinosaurs, or whatever, but again, like, still, I'm not saying that you can't run these cards at all, I'm just saying that some of these cards, sometimes feel like, well, they're not doing enough, and they're not giving you enough of ability to have that intention behind your deck and enough like direction in your deck as well, so you not having that impetus over them and having that ability to use them as you might need to, and having other abilities that will take that card from, okay, it's a card that's in my deck, to that card really does a lot of what I really need to do in this deck, because again, where am I going with this deck if I'm not really like progressing the whole idea of what I'm doing and getting to that next step and that next level. And again, that's one of those things, like, again, that's not just even taking into account that you have other opponents, because again, if you have any cards that do anything, there is that it dies to Doomblade argument. And again, I don't think you should not run cards or whatever, just saying that, or well, more specifically, I guess they die. But yeah, you shouldn't worry that they die to Wraths, or that they die to Doomblade, or whatever, they die to Path, or they die to Swords, or whatever it is. But or they die to counterspells. Again, same thing. But still, it's one of those things that you have to realize that those are, in fact, things that are in the format, and that they exist, and that people will play them, and they will counter your, Zendikar Resurgent, or they will counter or destroy your Zendikar Resurgent, or your Craterhoof, or whatever else it is. I'm not talking just about mana doublers or whatever, but there is always that potential of, well, people know that this can be a powerful card in some regards, but again, the format has changed quite a bit, which is why kind of people have moved away from some of these mana doubler type things, because again, a lot of them are 5 and 6 mana, and if you're, sinking most of your mana into this spell, that, you don't have much other mana up after you've kind of, played this spell, then it's kind of like, well, where is my payoff for casting this spell? How do I, get value off of a spell, or how can I manage or gauge the value that I got off that spell, and that's the thing. It's got to do something either on cast or straight away, and also, kind of do something for the rest of the game as well. And certainly it can do stuff for the rest of the game, but initially, again, if you're spending most of your mana on it, or even all of your mana on it, it's one of those things that it's like, well, I've spent my mana on this and I haven't got my value out of it. So therefore, I'm, really out of sorts when, someone destroys it or someone counters it or whatever before I really get the chance to use it. So it's one of those things that, you've got to sort of think to yourself, like, and again, mana ramp that is above, 3 mana has become a very small or a smaller part of the format as time has gone on. There are a couple that are out there. I think Nissa, Who Shakes the World's pretty darn decent if you're almost mono-green or mono-green, because it can protect itself. And once it gets to the ult, you kind of don't really care that much because, again, you've gotten enough value out of it probably anyway by that time, and it basically therefore doubles your mana anyway again from that point because now you've got all your lands in play basically from your deck. So at that point you really, really don't care. So it's just one of those things that, you've got to decide how worth it some of these things are. But, like a lot of the more enchantment versions of it don't really stack up because, again, they're just an enchantment and an do nothing, 5 mana, 6 mana, do nothing enchantment. Even the ones that sort of help out your board state to a degree, like Mirari's Wake and cards like that. It's one of those things. Yes, the buff is nice to an extent, but you're paying 5 mana for that, +1/+1 buff, and that's not a very big buff for a 5 mana investment. And if that's all you kind of get out of it, it probably really wasn't worth it. Doubling the mana again, is pretty good, but it's still not really what you wanted to do. I think cards that also take a lot of work to effectively get the payoff, even if they're sort of efficient, can fall into this trap as well. And you need to really be, kind of built around it. Siraisha Arachi Ascendant, that's the legendary mono-green commander that also flips into a legendary enchantment, but you have to reveal your entire hand and have 7 or more lands in your hand. And then it's basically whenever you tap a land for mana, you get double mana. That's really good if you can get it off quickly. But often enough, you won't get that off very quickly, and there's no real point in almost even playing it unless you know that you're going to be able to reveal your hand straight away and show that you have 7 lands in hand so that you can start tapping for double mana. So you already need 3 mana to cast this guy. So you would have needed 10 mana sources in your hand by turn, 3, which is very hard to do, or, within the first several turns. And again, that's just not that good of a rate, or whatnot. Like most of the time, you can get away with some of that, or you could get away with some of that stuff back in the day and whatnot, because again, Commander was a much slower format. There wasn't as many made for Commander cards. A lot of the power creep sort of cards that they've sort of produced in the last couple of years hadn't really been printed. But there's just so many powerhouse cards now that, Dockside Extortionist effectively says double your mana or even more. Mana Geyser, I'm not a huge fan of Mana Geyser, but it basically a lot of times does say double your mana. And you get that mana straight away for the most part. Jeska's Will's a really great variant of this because, again, it also can give you the cards to kind of play when you're kind of, not got a whole lot of, other place to put some of that mana, or you just don't have many more cards in hand, or whatever else, or not perhaps useful cards in hand, or whatever. But then again, it's a random selection of cards that you're going to exile off of the top with that. And you could get very lucky, but you could also just whiff and get, 3 lands or 2 lands and a random mana rock or something, and you're just like, sadness is on the stack. So again, it's just one of those things. The fact that you don't get any real payoff for your spell resolving until you untap with it, that's the biggest hurdle that I find. Yes, and again, that's the thing. Not to say that cards can't have or have to, you don't have to play all 1-drops or 2-drops or whatever else. You don't have to have hyper efficiency. No, but, just knowing how much value you're actually going to get out of something, yes, you can get that value out of some of these things. And Commander does allow that, and that's the great thing about it in a lot of ways. But just going, again, well, how about instead of me doing this, paying 5 mana or whatever it is, 6 mana or more, whatever it is, why don't I just actually ramp? Or why don't I just have ramp on my earlier turns, or whatever? Or why don't I have some other ramp, or whatever? Again, something that's a bit more consistent, or whatever, because I could just run a bunch of mana rocks, and yes, sure, they don't provide me with that burst of mana, but again, at least they're consistent and they get the job done at a certain point. And again, yes, they do get blown up and whatnot, but again, you can't be too worried about people blowing your stuff up because it's going to happen in games here and there, and sometimes it's not going to happen in games as well, or somebody's running Stony Silence or whatever else it is, or Collector Roof, and your mana rocks or whatever don't do anything, or your treasures don't do anything. But if you play Dockside Extortioners and got a bit of use out of your treasures and things like that, I don't think you'll be that sad, because again, if you hit turn 5, turn 6, whatever, turn 7, and you have 7 mana in play, then you're probably doing all right anyway, and you don't really need all of those lands and all those mana rocks at that point. So again, you're probably not too worried, even if you're not in that color, and almost all the mana doublers are in green anyway, and green really doesn't need the help to ramp that much more ahead. Yes, again, as I said, there are certain utility ones that are worth the time to think about, but for the most part, a lot of them I don't see the value in. There are some that, again, might be more useful than others, and it does depend on the deck, but again, for the most part, if I see somebody making that, and I know a lot of people are like this, seeing people make that greedy play of casting their Zendikar Resurgent, and that they're tapped out, well, I'm just gonna, Nature's Claim it, and then, you're gonna have wasted your mana. That's why, again, I've stopped playing a lot of cards that are effectively big and do nothing, because you spend all of this mana, invest all of this energy, and then somebody Swords to Plowshares it, and that isn't great for them in some ways, but it's really taken the wind out of your sails and really left you going, well, I really needed that, that card, or I really wanted that card, but what I should have actually been doing was having my game set up much, much more early and been ready to, do other things, or actually affect the game, or try to win, or try to push through with what I was already doing, rather than going, well, I hope, cross my fingers, and I hope that this sticks so that I can untap with it and then get value out of it, hopefully. That's the biggest problem with them. But yeah, those are my thoughts on that. here today. And you guys can always let me know your thoughts. Do you think I'm so super wrong about this? You can let me know down there in the comments below. Hope you've enjoyed either way, and hope you'll join me in another one.